Good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 p.m. Welcome to the third session of the Pacific Division Staff Services Confidence Building Series. We are holding weekly sessions through the month of June, and we're glad you could join us today. My name is Susan Wananen, and I'll be your facilitator for much of this series. Typically, I deploy in staff services, and I am a volunteer from the California Gold Country region. Sherry Lewis is our technology assistant and expert today and overall support for this series. Sherry, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I apologize for not coming off camera. I'm having some weather difficulties up here in the Sierra, but the good news is it's snowing, which is great news for all of us in California as far as our drought and fire concerns. So I apologize for no camera, but welcome today. I'm happy to help facilitate. I'll be monitoring the chat and watching for hands. So please let us know if you have any questions. If you have any technical difficulties, I'll throw my cell phone number in chat. If for some reason you're not able to reach out to us via chat, please send me a text message and I can assist that way. Other than that, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sherry. Really happy that you're here. I missed you last week. If you could please go to the next slide. See, I could do that too. Oh, thank you. So the goal for this series is to serve as a refresher. We want you to feel confident when you go out on a deployment. We want to provide practical tips for working in staff services, introduce staffing to people who might be curious about staffing and don't know that much about it. We want to provide an inclusive and collaborative environment to discuss staffing issues and want it to be a really safe place to ask questions because this is the time to ask, right? Rather than when you're on a deployment and you're not quite sure what to do. And then because we are inviting people who may either have deployed many times in staffing, as well as people who this is a new endeavor. We just want you to feel free to attend any or all of the series. We're going to be posting the next series, the sessions that we are going to be hosting in May. We'll email those to you in the next few days so that you can look ahead. And we understand too that you know, maybe Thursday afternoon isn't the easiest time for everyone to attend, and so we will be taping these as well. Sherry, if we could just go to the housekeeping. So during the presentation, we just have a couple of things. If you could please mute your microphone and your camera in an effort to preserve bandwidth if you're not speaking. And during the presentation, please put your questions in the chat. Sherry's going to be monitoring that and I'll be looking too, and that way we can make sure we don't miss any. And then after the presentation, you can raise your hand to ask questions that way as well. So like I mentioned, this meeting will be recorded, and if you have an Red Cross email, you're going to be automatically added to the distribution list. And let's see, if you're not and you want to be added, if you don't have a Red Cross email, please let us know. We can certainly add you separately. So to get started, every week we're asking you to please put your name and region in the chat so we get to know where you're from. And thank you for sharing that. And then today, I'm very excited for today, and we're excited for this series in general, but happy that you could join us, especially today. We have a guest speaker today who's going to talk about the ins and outs of disaster management, which is where much of staff services activities are involved in disaster management. You get to know it really well when you're on a disaster. So I'd like to introduce Paul Beatty, who's a manager on the National Workforce Mobilization and Support Team. Paul, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Susan, for the invitation. And it's great to see so many folks in the call today and a lot of familiar names and faces as well. All right, wonderful. Well, like Susan mentioned, I'm going to be chatting through the concepts around how we support our workforce using our volunteer connection system. Whether you've deployed in staff services 10 times or it's your first deployment, being familiar with what tools in volunteer connection are used to support our workforce is really important. So today's session will take about 45 minutes roughly. We'll leave time at the end for questions. And then I'll pause lots of times throughout the presentation for any questions that folks have throughout it as well. So we're going to sort of approach this like sort of a scenario. So I'm going to talk through several of the most common tasks that our staff services workers complete, predominantly at the service associate level. For those of you who may be considering a deployment in staff services, or who may experience a disaster in your own community and would like to assist in staff services. We're going to cover a few different circumstances, including how to support people locally, Red Cross volunteers and employees who are assisting with the response and live in the impacted area. We will cover how to receive and support workers from outside of the DRO as well. And then we'll also cover a few potpourri topics, as I like to call them. If there are any Jeopardy fans out there, it seems like, you know, every few shows there's a potpourri category. So let's dive in. And I do see a lot of familiar faces on the call, so, and including those that have much more experience with these tools than I do. So please, if something comes up that you're not quite sure about, or during the Q&A portions, if you'd like to jump in and clarify something I said, feel free. All right, let me go and share my screen and we'll get started. And
Paul, we do have one hand up.
Yeah.
Trina, do you have a question, ma'am? Katrina, oh, she put her hand down. Or no, Katrina, do you have your hand up? You're on mute. Okay, we'll come back to her in a little bit.
Sounds great. Thank you, Sherry. Okay, if someone can just give a thumbs up in Teams if they can see my web browser, that'd be awesome. Perfect, thank you. I'll try to be as verbally descriptive as possible in case anybody is dialed in on the phone only. I will also say that we do have screenshots of all this information available in the Volunteer Connection Disaster Management Job Tools. Those are hosted on the Exchange right now in the Staff Services Toolkit. There have been some pretty substantial changes to disaster management since we first put those together, however. So we are planning on releasing an updated version of those tools sometime this summer. So this probably looks pretty familiar to you, this page. Most of you log into Volunteer Connection to do a variety of things, right? Sign up for volunteer shifts, record your time, enter your responder availability, receive info from your chapter or your supervisor if you're on an active operation. But you may not have spent time in disaster management specifically. There are two ways that you can get to the disaster management tools in Volunteer Connection. The first, if you've got administrative access already, you can access it via the Administration tab up here at the top. So when you're assigned in Staff Services, there will be a disaster management link under the Administration tab. If you don't have current administrative access, then once you're assigned in Staff Services, one of these links below your name and picture and your volunteer send state will say DRO Disaster Management on it as well. Let me switch this hierarchy. Sorry, that got switched for some reason. Give me 1 second. There we go. And your version of Volunteer Connection may not look the same, obviously, depending on which community you're in. Okay, so I'm going to go to Administration and Disaster Management. I am currently assigned to a DR for testing purposes, but it's not in staff services, so that's why that link does not appear. Okay, so you will see something that looks relatively similar to this. If you're going into disaster management for the first time, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit to show you some specific things, you may see that up at the top of your disaster management page, it would say in this drop-down menu, select incident. And when you're going into disaster management for the first time, you should pull down that menu and select the DR to which you're assigned. I can see a lot of them because I've got a higher level of access, but you typically should only see the DR that you are assigned to. So let's say, for example, that we're assigned to 637, which is the New Mexico fire where Susan Wannen is assigned right now as the workforce AD. And you might see the screen change slightly when you select the DR to which you've been assigned. You may not have the ability to select all of these buttons. I'll explain more about that in a second. But we're going to start with one of the sort of foundational tasks of staff services, which is assigning the workers who are already assisting on the DRO. Most often, by the time a DRO number is created and the DR is entered into volunteer connection by the RMS team, who are my colleagues at the National, there are already workers on scene. They're DAT volunteers. They might be setting up a shelter. They could be in county EOCs, meeting with partners. So one of the first key tasks that your staff services manager should be encouraging you to do is to find out who is volunteering at that point in time, who's already out at those shelters, who might already be distributing food. And once you've got that list, then we need to ensure that they are assigned to that response. And you do that, let me zoom out again a little bit, by going down to the DRO staffing row on this page, which is the fourth row. So we've got incident, lodging, door, and DRO staffing. When you get over, sorry, the door row, my apologies. DRO staffing is the second thing we'll talk about today. So on the row that says door, you will not be able to click on all these buttons, but you should be able to click on the assign button. The assign button is where this person with the hard hat is over here, so the fifth button over. And that will take you to a screen that should bring up the available workers within your jurisdiction. Right now, I can see everybody, right? And I have the option of selecting the various regions around the country, but typically volunteer connection defaults to whatever jurisdiction you're from. So let's say it's from the California Gold Country, for example. This shows the workers who are currently available, who put in their availability. So let's say, for argument's sake, though, that the worker that's already assisting at that shelter did not put in their availability before the disaster, and that's okay. What we can do is go over all the way to the right-hand side of the columns, and where it says currently available, way over here on the right-hand side, you'll change that drop down from yes to no, or all, excuse me. Once you've done that, it should bring up all of the responders within that hierarchy. So I do encourage you to type in somebody's first name, last name, something. Otherwise, especially if there are a lot of people accessing the system at one time, it can take a while. for that to appear. But let's just identify, we'll focus on Tammy here. How about that? So let's say that Tammy is volunteering at a shelter, and we want to assign her to make sure that she has her assignment recorded in Volunteer Connection so that she is a part of the response. She can be communicated through Volunteer Connection as being a part of this job. But also so our stakeholders around the organization can have visibility into the true number of people that are assisting. So we're going to click this little person icon over here in the left-hand column to assign her. And we select the fields. I'm not going to go into great detail on these, but I just want to call out a couple specifically that are really important. Once again, we do have on-demand training courses available for the Volunteer Connection disaster management tools, and then the job tool that has screenshots and things like that. You select what position they're doing, the date that they were assigned, the date they intend to depart to travel to the response, which may be the same day they're being assigned, especially if they are local to that response. Their expected arrival date, you also need to fill in. This next one, though, that's got a star next to it is one of the most critical ones on this page, and that's the expected release date. It defaults to 14 days from the date that you're assigning the person. But it is a good idea to either contact that individual or work with their supervisor to determine how long they anticipate staying on the DRO. This is a really key field because some of the other functionality in Volunteer Connection is based on this value. So we're introducing some new supervisor roster functionality later on in the summer. And some of our existing supervisor roster functionality will show supervisors and managers how many days are left on that person's assignment. So they can either work with staff services to request a replacement, make sure they fill out their eval on time, or just ensure workforce planning, right? Making sure they're receiving a day off. So even though it defaults to 14 days, they may be staying longer than 14 days, they may be staying less than 14 days. It is important to change that value to the correct date that they're expected to depart.
Paul, we have one question about that. Is the expected release date their last day worked or their out process travel day home or travel home day?
It's a great question. It's the latter of those for right now. So the day out process. So let's say, for example, their last work day is today. We would put 4/22 on there if they're, for example, coming into headquarters tomorrow morning to do the out processing and checkout process.
Thank you. Does that answer everyone's questions on that? Can we get a thumbs up? Perfect.
Awesome. So once the transportation type is selected, depending on which one you select, additional rows might pop up. The main reason why is if somebody is flying to the response, they require an additional level of support. They need a place to stay. They need a fully funded mission card for their expenses. But for most local workers, typically their transportation type is going to be a Red Cross vehicle, a privately owned vehicle. They may take a public transportation to get to their job site, and that's okay. So in that case, we would select other. So we'll select privately owned vehicle for right now. You see that the airport information went away. It assumes that they're not getting a $450 mission card. We'll talk more about the type of card that is available for local workers here in a second. And it assumes that they're not getting an MCPC, which is Mass Care Procurement Card. although they may in fact be receiving one of those as well. And we'll talk about how to add one of those onto the assignment. Once you've selected that, their transportation type, then we select where they're reporting to and where their eventual work location will be as well. We'll talk here in a bit about how to add work locations, because there are a few data management principles around that as well to make sure that our workers are being tracked correctly and those locations can show up in some of our other visibility tools. In this case, let's say they're showing up at the Red Cross office to do their DRO orientation and check in, but their actual work location is going to be at the First Baptist Church, let's say that. Once we've identified where they're reporting to and where their actual job site is, then we select which supervisor they are connected to. This list that appears is all the workers that have been checked in to that response. So if you're assigning local workers who are already assisting, we recommend starting from the top down. So either the RDO or the job director or the DPM, and then going to the managers and supervisors and ending up with the service associates, so that you check in the more senior people first, which allows them to be visible in this supervisor listing as well. So we'll say, for example, that Carol Gottlieb is this person's supervisor. By selecting it, it will allow Tammy's name to appear on Carol's team roster, and it will also appear on our staff roster. So, and we'll talk more about the reports that are available here in disaster management shortly. Now, I'm not actually going to click the submit button, or else Tammy might be concerned that she's being assigned to go to New Mexico and Arizona. But assuming that it is a travel assignment or an in-person assignment, once I click the submit button, it sends her the pre-assignment health questionnaire to complete. And I'm sure a lot of you have filled that out before or have filled it out for others. And essentially, it asks them to answer questions about any health concerns or conditions. It lets them know what the hardship codes or the conditions are on the response. Is it cold? Are there travel concerns? Are there water quality concerns or air quality or whatever else it might be? Assuming that they are completing a virtual assignment, however, so you'll see I'll select virtual here in the reporting location. You'll see that the screen down at the bottom changed. It says virtual responders do not require the health questionnaire. So the interesting thing is that once you assign somebody to an in-person location, they have about 1 hour to complete the pre-assignment health questionnaire before their assignment times out. So we see some challenges with local worker assignments specifically, where the local worker doesn't know they're being assigned to the DR because they've been working the whole day already or several days already on that response if it's a DAT response. And so they don't know to look for that. It shows up in a text as well as an email. So it is important before you assign local workers to either communicate with them that they're going to be assigned and to fill out the pre-assignment health questionnaire if it's an in-person opportunity, either inform them directly or have the RDO or the DPM or whoever their supervisor is send that info to them as well. All right, so that's how we assign a local worker to the response. We ran some data on level 2 and 3 DRs specifically a few months back, And what we found is that like 9 out of 10 level 2 and 3 DRs had at least one person assigned. Some did not because they were more for accounting purposes. They didn't have workers assigned per se. But almost all of our level 2 and 3 DRs, which are the most common DRs that we've got, they do have people assigned. And of those people who are assigned, again, about 90% of them across all level 2 and 3 DRs are from the impacted area. So if we do nothing else in staff services, assigning local workers should be our first task. Okay, I'll pause there. Any questions about the information I've talked about so far?
Hey, Paul, it's Susan. I just have if you could explain the difference between a level 2 and level 3 and how that's designated?
Sure, of course. So at the Red Cross, we increase our ability to respond based on the scope and scale or the size of the disaster. We give each disaster a number level between 1 and 7, 1 being the lowest, 7 being the largest. Those disasters and those disaster levels are numbered based on cost. So once the cost of responding to a disaster rises above $10,000, and that is a level 2 response, and we put a DR number to that, and we put it in our volunteer connection system. A level 3 DR, I think, is $50,000 is where it starts, and then it goes up from there. Any other questions about assigning local workers at this point?
It must be crystal clear, Paul. You're doing a great job.
All right. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. Or everyone's like, oh, no, too much information, which it very well may be.
It's all good.
Yeah. And Jane, I have not yet talked about that topic, back the dated entry, but we will talk about that. So thank you for bringing that up. Okay, all right, so let's take a look at, now that we've assigned somebody, how to check them in. So for checking somebody in, and we'll continue our scenario that it's a local person. And Elizabeth's question in the chat is, can we backdate assignments? You cannot from the screen we just showed. However, there is a way to do a backdated assignment once they are out processed from the DR, or if they were not assigned to start with. So if we found a list of like 10 shelter workers that we forgot to assign, the DR is wrapped up, then we can put that in, and I'll show you where that tool is. And that's why it's really important to try to assign them as close to their start date as possible. Okay. And I see some more questions coming in. I'll take a break here in a second and respond to those. So once we've got workers assigned, we have to check them in. And that status change is important because it lets us know that they've arrived. They're starting to do their job or their response activity, and that we don't have to worry about them, especially if they're a traveling volunteer, right? They might be stuck somewhere. But in terms of local workers, it is still important to check them in as well. So if you recall, the door row, which is disaster operations open requests, is where the assign button is. The check-in is under the DRO staffing one. The first one I tried to go to, but now we actually are taking a look at that one. So once you click the arrival check-in button, you'll see a list of those who are assigned but not yet checked in. The first thing I wanted to point out is that over here on the right-hand side is their pre-assignment health questionnaire status. So if you've got somebody that has not yet submitted it, they won't appear in this default listing. So if you assign somebody for an in-person response and you're like, huh, that's weird, they're not showing up here, check this PAHQ status filter and change it to not submitted, and typically they will show up at that point. But you won't be able to actually check them in at that time. They'll have to complete that before you've got that option. So if you're assigning and checking in local workers who are already assisting on the response, you can check them in as soon as possible. Because again, we're trying to play catch up, right? They've already started to work on the job. We'll cover in a second what to do if they have not started work yet, or if they're traveling from outside of the impacted area, because that's a whole separate story. But for a local worker or a remote assignment, it's okay to check them in, assuming you've got knowledge that they are in fact working already or will start very soon. So we'll click this check-in button. The majority of the information on this screen is pulled over from the assignment. So all that information that we filled out in the first step now appears. The first step may be completed by a staff services worker on the DR. It may also be completed by the recruiter who's recruiting them for assignment from some other area. So you can see whoever assigned Sailor filled out all this information, filled out the person's supervisor. And then the lodging information is covered in a separate tool now, which I'll briefly introduce here in a second. But this does give us the opportunity, if let's say the person doing the assigning clicked the wrong button, and this person actually is from outside of the impacted area, then we have the ability to include a proxy number. And if we do that in this screen, it automatically triggers the request to load that card. So if you do have a local worker and you're providing what are called M&T cards, which are loaded for $150 and cover like one lunch a day and gas costs and mileage, then you can select that here, M&T, put in the proxy number of that card, and that request would automatically be sent to the team that loads those. Once you verified that all this information is correct, you can see the expected release date is up here at the very top. It's priority field. Then all you have to do is click that check-in button. I'm actually not going to do that right now. So that's if they're a local responder, right? They've already started to work or it's a remote assignment. Assuming that they haven't started work yet, like let's say we're out in front, right? We're being proactive. We're assigning for somebody who's going to start on Sunday or Saturday, right? Or we have a person on our check-in screen that's arriving from outside of the impacted area. Please do not check them in until they are actually there. Sometimes we have some staff services folks who get really excited and check in a whole lot of people at one time, but the not checked in status does play a big role in some of our other tools, like visiting workers receiving arrival info and stuff like that. Plus our national tools in RCW, for example, very clearly say who is still traveling to that disaster and which workers are checked in or already there. So if you've got a worker that's not physically in the disaster area yet, then please wait to check them in until they're actually standing in front of you, or they have called you to say, hey, I've landed, I'm at my job site, or whatever else, right? All right, so I'm going to pause there again. Looks like we have some more questions coming into the chat box. Sherry, I'm more than willing to just take these one at a time if that's okay with you.
Sounds good.
All right, cool. So the back the dated entry we'll talk about here in a second. Janine asked, what is the proper procedure for assigning shelter teams? Make up the teams for specific locations or just assign people and let the shelter lead make up teams and locations? It's a great question. We're going to talk about locations very briefly today. I don't think we'll have time to go too in-depth into it, but we do want staff services to put in the job locations by site. So if they are at a school, we want that to be in as a separate one, versus a faith-based partner or a Red Cross office or something like that. Typically, though, we do need to go to the DPM or whoever's in charge of mass care to get those sites. And so we do need to create those in volunteer action and associate those with the disaster before we assign and check people in. And so again, I'll briefly cover that here in a second. Okay. So Patricia asked, the mission cards, is that something that staffing handles, or are DPMs supposed to send people with them on a deployment? Great question. If it's a travel deployment, the sending Red Cross team should provide that. So if they're going from one county to the other, one state to the other, from the West Coast all the way across the country or wherever, whoever is sending them should provide that. But it's not a perfect thing, right? Sometimes a worker lives, hours away from that Red Cross location. They may not have time, right? They may need to get to that disaster before that worker can get in touch with them. So we do have workers that do arrive on DROs from outside of the impacted area without a card. And so staff services should be prepared to issue those in the event that they arrive without one. Again, we don't see that high number of those. But if you're giving those M&T cards to local workers, then staff services would be the one responsible for that. And so you may need to work with your workforce engagement manager, your direct services manager, or whomever retains those cards during steady state to request enough to make sure that all those folks have one. But again, the vast majority of people coming from outside of the impacted area should bring that with them because they use that to pay for baggage fees, to, buy lunch or dinner on their travel day and that type of thing. All right, when we become aware that someone was already working on the DRO before being assigned, how can we record the fact that the person doing out processing knows to do the backdated entry? Great question. We don't have a way in the system to record that. So right now, we encourage folks to keep track of those, to let your supervisor know who those people are, or send a note to the workforce engagement manager, assuming you don't have somebody replacing you in staff services, so they can assist with that task as well. Juanita says, once they are assigned, when are they notified to make travel arrangements? So once a deploying worker is assigned, if they're in person, they complete the pre-assignment health questionnaire. And then once that's completed and either auto approved by the system or manually approved by a health reviewer, then the worker will receive a web link to their DRO assignment record, which has a phone number to call for Carlson Wagonlit. So the people doing the recruiting, and we're not covering deployment per se today, but generally the person doing the recruiting and deploying somebody out to some other jurisdiction should say, wait until you get that you've been assigned email, because we do have folks that, the recruiter says, I'm assigning you, they don't fill out the pre-assignment health questionnaire and call CWT right away, but it does require them to complete that pre-assignment health questionnaire before they can make their arrangements. Okay, so that's the check-in screen. Let's cover the backdated piece really quickly. So we'll go back to disaster management. Yeah. And as you see again on the DRO staffing tab, there's the backdated entry tab, the fifth one over. It's a very similar format, but all of the fields aren't the same. It's more backdated, right? It's post assignment. So you select the person. Typically, the workers from the impacted area are the ones who appear. I may be able to see a higher number because of my access levels. Let's say Karen Adamson, go. You can select her check-in date, all the information that we recorded on the assignment page, what date she was released from the job, what her release code was, whether a job was completed, which is the typical choice, and then what she was assigned in, who her supervisor was, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not 100% sure on this. I'll have to get back to Susan and Sherry on this, but I'm pretty sure that you can only backdate somebody's assignment 3 days following their out processing. And I'll show you a second place where we can do that as well. So if somebody's been assigned after the fact, but they actually started to work like 2 days before, you'd have to wait until 3 days following their out processing to go back and change their start date. If they weren't assigned to the DR in the first place, then there is no time boundary on that because they weren't assigned. But it's pretty straightforward, and that there is a job tool in progress about this. But once again, our strong preference is that they be assigned as soon as possible. Right. Laura asked a great question. Can you please review when to assign someone to the operation versus just inputting them into a shift in the DRO shift tool? We're actually getting ready to release some new guidance about this summer. Fingers crossed anyway. And so it's not a firm boundary right now, but typically we use the DRO shift tool for those who can only give us a portion of time each day. So it might be a 4-hour shift, a 6-hour shift, or frankly, even a 12-hour shift, but they're not doing that longer than 3 consecutive days at a time. So if you've got a worker who's even showing up for 6 hours a day for more than 3 days in a row, it's okay to go and assign them. If they're not, then you would want to create a shift in the DRO shift tool and sign them up through that option. Or let's say they're doing a full, 12-hour day or 10-hour day on Monday, Tuesday, and Friday. You can do, or let's see, Monday through Wednesday, and then let's say Friday through Sunday. You could either assign them twice and have 2 separate assignments for those 3-day periods, or you could create shifts on the DRO shift tool for them and do it that way. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. That's one of the reasons why we're sort of revising our guidance on that and exploring what the most effective and efficient way is to do that. So for the time being, just check in with your supervisor or the workforce engagement manager, whoever the staffing manager is on that response, to determine what strategy you're going to employee. As long as it's consistent on that DR, we're not as concerned about, you know, X number of days before signing or that type of thing. So that is the clearest non-response response I can provide, I think.
Hi, Paul. Janella has her hand up. Do we have a moment to have a question?
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, she put her hand down.
Oh, well, yeah, I put it down because I'll forget to put it down after I ask my question.
Okay. Hi, Janella.
Paul, when you're backdating, it's sometimes when you're backdating, for instance, of course, you include the dates that the worker was volunteering before they were in process, but their out processing date, does that remain the same date that they actually out processed?
It does, yep.
Okay. Because we had some confusion on dates overlapping, but all right. So just so that I'm clear, if a person actually started working on the 7th, but they weren't in process until the 9th, and they out processed on the 21st. So I'm going to backdate it to the 7th and still put their out processing date as the 21st.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And I'll show you here in a second, if somebody's already been assigned to the DRO, how you can modify their assignment dates. But if they were not assigned to the DRO at all in the first place, then this is the page at which to see that through. All right. Well, in the 13 minutes or so we have left, there are a few additional topics I wanted to cover. And I'm more than willing to come back for a second session. I would definitely encourage you all to do the disaster management on demand courses in Edge, review those job tools. But there are a few additional things that I wanted to cover. These are more like potpourri, quick type topics. You may have occasion as a staff services worker to look up contact information for somebody. Let's say there's somebody assigned to your response that's coming from outside of the impacted area, and you want to get their phone number to reach out to them or send an email to them. There are two ways you can do that. The first is by clicking on their name in the check-in screen. Oh, Susan, your DR checked your people in. Let's see if anybody is on the check-in screen from one of the other DRs. Let's see. Anybody on 655?
They're so efficient.
They are. I know. That was fast, too. Must have heard that I was using them as an example. Maybe Toledo? Nope. So you may have seen earlier that there was a way to click on the person in the check-in screen. That'll bring up a smaller window that will show you their contact information. The other way you can do it is using this account lookup button over on the right-hand side. So you can look up individuals by what jurisdiction they're from, their first name, last name, contact information, all that type of thing. So let's say, for example, I'm looking for Susan's profile. I can put in her first and last name, and there she is. So if you click the edit button, I don't know if you'll always have the access to do that, but you should be able to look up at least some buddy's email address that way. The other way you can do it is by running a staff roster. And disaster management reporting is something that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on today. I could actually spend like 2 hours talking about it, but in the DRO staffing row, it's over here in the queries section. And so the one that I'll highlight today for the purposes of our scenario is the staff roster. So if you type in staff roster, there's a spreadsheet the version of that. which will download an Excel document, and then you can get their contact information that way as well. I'll come back to the questions in the chat here in a second. Both of them are really good questions, so I'll cover that here momentarily. Okay, so the next quick thing I want to cover is the staff management tab. Again, we could spend a whole lot more time talking about this, but for the purposes of our scenario, and the vast majority of people that you'll probably assign to a DR who are local to the impacted area, sometimes their job site might change. They might start working at one shelter but transition to a second shelter, or the headquarters may change from one location to a second location. If that's the case, you can modify that in the staff management tile. So again, DRO staffing, staff management, it's the second one right here. The little icons. Oh, I'm back in Toledo. Let's see, let's switch to Mexico. So let's see, person, people. There we go. So to update somebody's assignment, you click on that little rocket icon over here in the actions column.
Paul, we don't see your screen.
Got it. All right. Thanks, Janella. Can anybody see my website still?
Yes, I can.
I can see it.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I just can't. All I see is your handsome face.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Maybe that's a good question. Are you on a computer or a phone or?
No, I'm on my laptop. I'll just log out and log back in.
Okay, sounds great. So this is where you can also go to see somebody's contact information. The general information tab up at the top is where it records their assignment data and their arrival data. This is also where you can request a card for them. So let's say, for example, that they were a local worker and you're giving out M&T cards to those workers to cover lunch and gas mileage. Actually, let me find somebody that doesn't have one already. Hold on a second. Try to find somebody that is not from outside of the impacted area. Let's try to share. Oh, she has an MBA card too already. Okay, well, we'll just roll with it. So assuming that they don't have one already, when you select the value and type in the proxy number and click save, that will automatically submit the request to our card voters as well. Same with the MCPC. If you need to submit a request for an MCPC, then you can do that from this page as well. So on the work location tab, for example, though, to get back to our scenario, is where you can see where their current work location is. If you need to add an additional work location, you should use this plus button over here on the right-hand side. We don't want to remove the one that's currently there because we want a historical accounting of where they were at certain times and places. But once you click the plus button, it you can select the date. You can select the date they're anticipated to be at that work location. You pick the district of the response. This is related to setting up work locations, which I don't think we'll be able to cover today during the time. And then you select the work location where they start. For those of you who've been in staff management for a long time, for a while, work locations and work assignments could coexist at the same time. So you could be at 2 locations at one time, have 2 work assignments at one time. We're making some changes to the system to not allow that. So it's more clean data. And so that's why when it says from date 4/21/2022, that means that the existing work location will be concluded and this new one will be started. So that's why that is not selectable up there. Okay, and then let me answer some questions in the chat box, and then I'll bring up two final things, allow some time for any other verbal questions as well. So Susie asked, does posting a volunteer in Shift Tools give that worker DRO hours and volunteer connection? From my understanding, the way it works is that it shows up on the hours section of their profile if a DRO shift tool is created and they're assigned into that shift. If they're assigned to a DR, the only place that those assignment hours show up is on the My Profile Hours report, I think it's called. And they changed where that's located, so I'll have to get back to you on how to actually get to that. But it should work correctly, where if they're assigned to a DRO shift tool, then it would show up on their profile. It would be tracked in a separate place from their full assignment, but it would be on there. Jane brings up, is it correct that no one can be assigned to a date prior to the date the DR was created? Yes, that is accurate. So if you've got, let's say, a DR that started as a DAT response like 2 days ago, but the DR was put in with a start date of today, the first day that that worker's assignment could start would be today. So even though they were assisting with that from a DAT perspective for the last 2 days, if the start date of the DRO is today, today would be the first possible date. Juanita asks, what is the travel distance to receive the M&T card? And Eleanor replied, thank you, Eleanor, that is correct. So 50 miles is our general boundary for when someone would receive the M&T card. If they are above or beyond 50 miles, then they would receive the MDA card and be put in lodging. Now, that being said, the 50 miles is a general guideline. We want to stick to that as much as possible. But in some communities, somebody might be comfortable driving 55 miles to their work site. And as long as they're okay with that, and we're not placing a burden on the responder, the worker, that's okay. In some communities, traveling 20 miles to their job site might be challenging because of traffic or road conditions. So 50 miles is a general assessment, but check with your supervisor to make sure that what this strategy is for that job specifically. Okay, Ron brought up in the shift tools, they must be marked as attended in order to get the hours. Thank you, Ron. Good point. And Himni brings up that, oh, thank you. If you look in the chat, you can see where to find the profile hours report. It's under My Reports, which is, let me show you here from the homepage. Administration, My Reports. There should also be a web link for My Reports over here somewhere if you don't have administrative access. And then once we go to My Reports, we will look for hours. There we go, profile hours report right here. And then when you click on that, you can, PDF is our preferred export for that. You click run and it should appear. Okay, so I know we're almost at time. The two final things I wanted to bring up are if you need additional support, your supervisor is always a great place to start. But if your supervisor is not available, you can always reach out to disaster.staffing at redcross.org. .org. That is monitored from 8 in the morning Eastern time to 10 p.m. Eastern time, roughly 11 p.m. Eastern time. I'll drop that web address or address in the chat box. And so we have volunteers who are on call, a few from the Pacific Division who are on this call. And thank you to those of you who do monitor that, who respond. So if you have a technical question, something doesn't look right, you know, whatever, we're here to support. So you can always reach out to us there. I know, Susan and Sherry, there were a few topics I wasn't able to get to today, but I know that we are over time. So I think I'll pause there. Any other questions or things you'd like to talk about this afternoon?
Well, I have to say, Paul, I mean, the number of questions and the participation today kind of indicates how important and how invested people are in the topic. So thank you. We might have you come back for an encore to help answer more questions later in the series. Sherry, are there any questions before hands raised before we wrap up?
I don't see any questions in chats. I just see a lot of great presentations, and thank you, Paul. And I would echo those sentiments. Thank you, Paul, very much for all of your knowledge and wisdom today. And I certainly hope that we can have you back, because it sounds like there is a lot more information you can share with us. And the audience certainly appreciated all of your subject matter expertise. We do have a hand up, so I'm going to go over and see really quickly. Dorothy, can you come off mute and ask your question or give us some feedback?
Okay. I was looking in my hours report on the other computer, and like I was in Kentucky for December, and there's no, so far I haven't found where to find those DRO hours. It's not in that report, unless it's like at the very top or at the very bottom or something.
It's
But
probably
there's
at the
nothing-
very bottom.
The very bottom? Going to the bottom. Ah. Response deployments. Okay. There it is.
Yay.
How does
Excellent.
numbers meld in with your ordinary hours? Or do they just not? Ever?
That's a great question. I think we might have to ask volunteer services how that works.
I will do that. Thank you much.
Yeah. So thanks again, everyone. We just really appreciate you joining us today. Please, speaking of hours, if you could report them for these sessions, that would be really helpful. Our next session is next Thursday, April 28th at 1 p.m. We're going to be discussing the daily check-in tool and what it means to someone who's working on the staff services team. And that's going to be presented by Nina Napolitano. So thanks again for attending. We'll see you all next week. And thanks so much, Paul, for coming and sharing all your great knowledge with us today.
Anytime. Yeah, thank you, Susan, and to everybody for being on here today. I look forward to seeing you on a future assignment. So thank you all very much.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Paul.